And Krista, it was you who asked about militant eschatology, right? Okay, so it's not clear how he's using it in that article because he kind of uses it and goes on and uses it in the opposite way too. Like his phrasing's not really clear. But I did find him talking about it in this book called Theology of the World, and he doesn't give us much more, but it makes more sense that because he's talking about militant optimism, and he's contrasting militant optimism with creative eschatology, and he uses militant to say that it's actually trying to do something, so that it's politically engaged. So he's trying to make the argument that both are politically engaged, but one has poor motives and the other one, like one is just about, I'm forcefully just willing for something to be better, and the other is I'm going and acting with God in creative work towards something better. So that's, yeah, it's still not 100% clear, but that's as far as I could go with what I have of Mets here. So
Thank you. I appreciate you looking into it more.
yeah, yeah. I when I teach this in class, I normally get because I do normally assign a lot more readings in an undergrad class. And so I'd have people just send me words all week long, and then I come in, and that was the first thing we would do. We'd have a page of words, and we would just walk through them, like talking about what are they, and um, so that was always a fun part of the class. You can only do so much in a class. Okay, so I'm gonna set it up here. In oh yeah, that works. And can do this, and we will jump in. Um, oh, why did it do that? Ah, this now Zoom has done something weird. It's actually that's kind of not bad because it's got you there, but I'm wondering what it's recording. So this isn't right. Okay, let's just do this. Gallery. Ah, whew. Okay, so if I'm pinned, and if I go to speaker, I don't want it to be two screens. Sorry about this. So weird. Oh no. Okay, well, this is kind of a problem because I don't want it to be not recording the right thing. Um, oh, there we go. Oh, sorry. And I recorded all of that. So the class is going to have fun with like, what was that? So I have you all on one screen now. So this is good. That should be recording correctly. And now I'm just going to try and take that and move it over to, ugh, why do you not do that? There we go. And OBS. Okay. Whew. So when the technology starts fighting, you know you're in trouble. Okay, so we're going to talk about liberation theology tonight, and I was looking at all the various different ways that I approach it, and I have courses where I'll teach it up to 4 lectures just on liberation theology, not because it's the most recent, but it is this significant adaptation of political theology that allows a whole bunch of other contextualized versions to come. So it's like a stepping stone from political theology into this very contextualized theology that is about all about standing in solidarity with the people who are on the underside of history, to use the phrases of liberation theology. And then we have coming out of it, what we'll look at a bit next week, things like feminist theologies, which will come in and they'll stand with um, women in their lived experience of patriarchy, and trying to say, how do we negotiate a better way? What critiques can we bring to bear on the situations that we find ourselves in? And so there's a whole bunch of them that will emerge from this. And I think I have it in the slides at some point. The best liberation theology, the new stuff today, is actually not coming out of Latin America where it was born. But we see liberation theology emerging, especially in countries like some of the African countries, and some of the South and Southeast Asian countries are they're moving further with this. Because those are contexts that tend to be more wrestling with, their colonial past and dependence and poverty and those situations that really gave rise to liberation theology. So we're going to hit these four things today: solidarity, conscientization, which we've mentioned before, and I'll talk about the context in which it's being done, which are the base ecclesial communities. So think of it as home groups, but not Bible studies. So we'll get there. And then we'll look at the primary methodology, which is going to be very familiar to you because we're used to thinking about the hermeneutic spiral, and it's the see, judge, act. But they're using it in a very specific way in liberation theology. So it's good to understand the methodology that's being used. Is that good? Hopefully. So to introduce liberation theology, in the text that I assigned, which is over in my box, you're given a series of statistics on poverty, and they're from the 80s. So what I like to do is bring us up to date a little bit. And in 2024, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization estimates that about 733 million people of the 8.3 billion people in the world suffer chronic undernourishment. That is 8.2% of the global population, with mainly in South and Southeastern Asia, as well as South. So there have been, with improvements over the statistics that you got from the 80s, the ratio in South and Southeastern Asia, as well as South America. But the situation is worsening in Africa, where the estimates predict 60% of world hunger will be in Africa in 2030. And despite the improvements, about 2.3 billion people are moderately or severely food insecure in 2024. And that's been a new language that's come up, this notion of food insecurity. And you probably hear that a lot when we're talking about the rising cost of groceries and all of that in our context. I know that food insecurity has been huge. If you have a church that's near a university, you probably now have students coming to get food vouchers or whatever it is that the church is offering to give out. So that's a shift that's happened. So I'd encourage you to look at the data put out by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, or to go to worldhunger.org, which is where I got this helpful infographic. Latin America, as a developing region, has the most successful record in increasing food security, which is important to note, as important new developments in liberation theology today come out of African and Asian contexts. The hardest hit by systemic poverty are the most vulnerable, the children. Children are the most visible victims of undernutrition, including fetal growth restriction, stunting, wasting, and deficiencies of vitamin A and zinc, along with suboptimum breastfeeding. Undernutrition magnifies the effect of every disease, including measles and malaria. The estimated proportions of death in which undernutrition is an underlying cause are roughly similar for things like diarrhea, malaria, pneumonia, and measles. Malnutrition can also be caused by diseases, such as the diseases that cause all those other things. So reducing the body's ability to convert food into usable nutrients. So all of this, despite the fact that we can actually produce enough food, we have the capacity to produce enough food to adequately feed everyone in the world. The principal problem is that many people in the world still do not have sufficient income to purchase or land to grow enough food. And the chief causes of hunger and food insecurity worldwide is poverty. So the bigger question is, what is the cause of this poverty? So I'm just going to list a few. So harmful or unjust economic systems. So I'm going to move myself up here small, and you can see them. Oh yeah, I was in the way of the diagram. Okay, you have the slides. So harmful or unjust economic systems. So essentially, control over resources and income is based on military, political, and economic power that typically ends up in the hands of a minority who live well, while those at the bottom barely survive if they do. So this is a lingering effect of colonization, this establishment of dependence economies, where countries and regions are forced to produce a limited number of crops to meet global needs. But this undercuts their agricultural diversity of the region. And the saddest part of it is that because of the artificial demand that it creates, when they have these monocultures or monocrops, what do they call it? Mono agriculture, like this very focused agriculture, the people who are producing it are often unable to afford the goods they produce. So the food that they grow is well beyond what they can. It's not going to be sustaining for them, and it's also not going to be something they can afford. So we think about things like coffee and chocolate. These tend to be industries that are crops that are susceptible to this. And I see this same thing happening in manufacturing today, where we have certain kinds of manufacturing pushed to certain countries where we can leverage the fact that they have cheap labor. And so they're producing things that come back to the affluent West, and we spend all kinds of money on expensive phones that people who are there working on them and building them could not afford. Conflict is another one that's worth looking at. Looking at the 2024 to 2025 data, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees establishes that over 117 million people are forcibly displaced by war and conflict. This is considerably more than the 2012 data that I used in my last teaching of this course. And if the state of conflict in our world is any indication, we're not going to see any improvements anytime soon. Refugee statistics are significant because if you do any work with refugees, you know that often they can spend years trying to get refugee status in a welcoming country to even get there in the first place. And then once they're there, it can take up to 5 years just to get stabilized, and then another 5 or so years to integrate into the culture of the new country. So it's not a quick process, and it's often a painful process. We worked with this one family from Eritrea, and they had to flee. So the father and one son went to Israel. They managed to flee to Israel, and the mother and the 2 other sons fled to Egypt. And so it was like 10 years or something before they were actually reunited. It was like a long time to be away. And so here you have this father who's been here trying to get his family over, and he's now meeting his children who are like 10 years older than the last time he saw them. Like it's just it kind of blows my mind that, you know, that we're living in a world where these are the realities. And hunger also creates cycles of poverty and hunger. It's hard to get ahead of it if you're not getting the nutrition you need. Overpopulation. This is an interesting one because we often think that this is going to be a rural issue, but it's actually not. In rural contexts, they deal with they deal with people a lot better. In fact, the UN reports that in 2024, 75% of the world's food insecure population is in urban and peri-urban contexts. Um, and that's because we have people flocking to these cities, and there's only so many resources. And it's not like in the cities you can grow food or sustain yourself that easily. Although on CBC this morning, they were talking a lot about all the people that got chickens, backyard chickens during COVID. So maybe we're trying to do something. And then climate change. The conservative estimates from the World Health Organization predict that about 250,000 deaths a year are due to climate change. And those numbers are hard to measure, but what is been measured quite reliably is the heat-related deaths and how that's gone up. So the death toll right now for heat-related causes is around 546,000 deaths every year. So over 500,000 deaths every year just from the environment changing. The human impact of climate change is most readily felt by those who are already vulnerable to all of the other aforementioned causes of hunger. And, you know, one of the consideration that will likely be added to this list is disease, especially as we see people who are, you know, the U.S. aid project being shelved. We see a lot of the efforts that have been there to try and curb various different diseases being curtailed or challenged. And hunger increases the effects and lethality of disease. It's one thing to look at all of these statistics, and in the introduction to the text, we're even offered some personal anecdotes about the brutal effects of poverty and hunger. And such stories are helpful to put a human face on these cold, hard statistics. But often this is where we start and end in traditional approaches to tackling poverty and hunger. We are moved by our stories of our experiences and the cold, hard facts. We get an idea of what we can do to help. We imagine something and then we go and do that thing. And in the West, we primarily respond through charity. Now, I put up a video from a TEDx conference of a friend of mine, Al, who he's the one who he's established like a charitable organization that worked on the border of Thailand and Myanmar. And so it's anyway, his work is a lot of it was really heartbreaking, but he was really challenged by the ways that charities are so dysfunctional. But charities for us in the West, well, they cause problems. What kind of challenges do you think there are with charities?
Well,
I
there's
think what determines
administrative costs.
what determines proceeds.
Yeah. Okay. Ian, do you have something to add, or?
I mean, I think I'm pretty much on the same sort of wavelength. But I'd say a lot of the problems with charities are going to come down to like how do you popularize your specific issue? So if your charity is not receiving the same attention as another one because it's easy to advertise or put into media, then it can go unreported or it can go underfunded, regardless of the need for funding, because the marketing wasn't there in the first place. So it kind of comes down to just that human factor of awareness and then selling, so to speak, your charitable organization.
Okay. This is where I think Metz is a little bit helpful for us with this militant eschatology and militant optimism. I think you'll enjoy the video. It's challenging. Al's a very interesting guy. But so you're right. There is truth to that it is really hard. There's so many causes out there. It's hard to get attention to yours. But the bigger problem is that a lot of the organizations that are working as charitable organizations are very inefficient in how they're using the funds, and they are committed to a lot of things that are really ineffectual. And he does the example of Samaritan's boxes, which you probably have participated in. Yeah, he talks about why that's really not a great idea. So he kind of breaks down the problems with it. And he's someone who's built a charity and works with charities, but he's very concerned about the way that, especially in the West, we give to charities and we assume that we've done our deal. We've done our bit to fix the problem. And he's saying, no, it's a lot more to it. It's like, to me, it's like the democratic process, right? Sometimes we say, okay, well, I'm just going to vote and that's going to be it. But no, we need to actually be engaged. A democracy works when people are engaged with it. And all of those other things work as we engage and we ask questions and we investigate and hopefully get things working better. Krista?
I think this was touched on in that BOF article that we read too, that it's you just giving charity isn't enough because people become reliant on that and don't learn how to become self-sufficient. So giving them a plant rather than giving them the seeds type of thing to grow the plant and teaching them how to do that instead of just giving them the food. So it did touch on that, I think, in the BOF article. So that's another problem with charity is they just give, but the people don't ever become self-sufficient. They just rely on that.
Yeah, so my friend, another Alan, actually, we did the Bridging Poverty and Privilege workshops, which are going to go up on ChurchX, actually. I don't know if you're familiar with the ChurchX platform, but there's a lot of really good learning on there. So we did this one called Bridging Poverty and Privilege, and they've been working in that space for many years. And he has this thing where he talks about, he goes, you give a person a fish and you feed them for a day. You teach a person to fish and then, you could feed them for a while. But the problem is they still have all those systemic things that are causing problems like pollution, wrecking the fishing, overfishing from other corporations. So there's all this injustice. He goes, but the real solution is to actually figure out what's causing this person to not be able to fish in the first place, because there's probably a reason why they're not just fishing. And so it takes it in this whole other direction, which is very challenging, I find. Very challenging. Life?
Yeah, I had some friends that used to say, like, we have a lot of people in the metro system that are just sitting there waiting for people to give them money. And one of my friends said, well, if you give them change, they won't change. So he says, I never give them change because we don't know where that money's going.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's some truth to that. Ian, you were going to say something?
The give a man a fish, feed them for a day, teach a man to fish. They can eat for a lifetime. But people learn better when they're full. And
Yes.
so providing both is really the important part in a lot of that. And I think that's kind of moving into what you were saying there, but it kind of gets sort of left off to the side where it's like, well, people also still do need to eat, right? So we can talk about the inefficiencies of charity for a very long time, but at the end of the day, like, well, we need to prop people up above the zero level and then start addressing things like the climate, the pollution, the inability to fish, all of that. But if people have no fish, then they're not eating, and then they're not learning, and they're not developing. And I think there's a big challenge within that of like, when a charity has this intention of doing good, that good still does happen. But how do you take that from that like 40% efficiency and move it up to an 80 or 100% efficiency?
And it's really hard to motivate hungry people to do the social work that's
Yeah,
required for them to actually, build a pathway out of their system of poverty.
absolutely. But, like, I think we can be really, really critical of these things. But I
Mm.
think at the end of the day, we also need to address like at least someone's getting fed. And that's a big start to it as well.
Mm-hmm. So I, the challenge here, and I think this is where in liberation theology too, because they were the recipients of a lot of charitable work, and the charitable work was not addressing the economic system that was oppressing them at all. And so that's part of the roots of where we get to. Now I'm going to move this back over here, and yeah, I'll just put it there. It'll be okay. So for some charities, they will even mobilize or go to help, but this often has a whole other set of problems. I have a friend who did a lot of work in the Brazilian context, and one of the things that was the bane for her was people who would do missional tourism. So they would come in doing a short-term mission, and which is great for you as the person doing it, but often it just leaves a mess. It doesn't actually accomplish the things that you are thinking it would accomplish, and often it causes harm. So for one thing, one of the things is if you come in and you build houses. Well, now you're cutting into the industries that are there that actually build houses. So instead of supporting the people who are there to build houses, you're actually, robbing them of the salaries that they could be getting. And so you're breaking the economy even more. And it's not like people are doing it intentionally. That was the article from last week. It's not like we're intending to do injustice. We're trying to do something good, but we need to really think about it and approach charity in a very critical way. On the positive side, true charity is action and commitment to the service of others, not a donation of our surplus, like we often think in the West. The saying in liberation theology is theology only rises at sundown. And it's another way of saying theology is a second act. You don't learn theology and then decide on actions. You engage in actions and then you reflect on it. What is missing in many implementations of charity is this second step. We are taught to be giving, and that giving is the ends. And we're taught that giving is something we do for ourselves. Miroslav Volf's Free of Charge is a brilliant examination of all the Western problems of giving, and it's a worthwhile read. It's a small book, and it's probably one of his most accessible books. The claim of liberation theology is that theology does not produce pastoral activity, it reflects on it. And the phrase from Paulo Freire is, "We make the road by walking." Like that really captures it. That's how we walk it out, but we walk it out in a way that's very reflective. So liberation theology starts with moral outrage. That's what Gutierrez will claim. This is Gustavo Gutierrez, the Peruvian theologian who wrote The Theology of Liberation. So unless you're attending to the world, you simply remain oblivious to what is going on. In North America, we psychologize religion a lot. And as a result, we frame socio-political issues as psychological issues, best approached through self-help works and personal development. It is largely about us, and secondly, about the other. And this is a spiritualized dependence economy, or a spiritual health on the backs of the poor, whom we really help only to help ourselves. And moral outrage can only come from looking outside of yourself. In liberation theology, you start not with a compassion for easing the suffering of others, but a moral indignation at the situations that lead to the sufferings of others. You have to make a judgment, but you also have to make a political commitment. Now, you can probably hear like the undertones of they're taking political theology and they're moving it into this context. Gutierrez's moral outrage is not simply directed at the effects of the situation, the fact that there are oppressed people. It's not just directed at the deprivation in itself, but primarily at the sinful injustices that caused it. So he's saying we have to get to that level. It's not just the fact that we have poor people and people suffering. We have to look at what gets us there. And the statistics can be used to evoke sympathy, but they're unable to give us insight into the necessary action. Human stories can also evoke compassion, but they're not enough, especially when what we primarily hear are the stories of people's encounters with the other and not the stories of the others themselves. One of the courses I took on liberation theology was under Dr. Heather Eaton, and she recounted having the privilege of going to Peru to study with Gustavo Gutierrez. But he actually, early on in that time together, he sent all of the non-South Americans home saying that they could not help there, that they need to go and do this work of addressing injustice in their own contexts. So why is that? Why would he tell them all to go away? Tan?
Yes, I'd like to know a little bit of the impact of the Vatican II, John Paul II, and also the Cardinal Joseph,
Ratzinger, yeah.
Ratzinger, yeah, please. Little bit of backup. Thank you.
Yeah, so normally if I'm teaching this in a larger setting, I usually go from the background of liberation theology, and then we look at the papal response because there was a pushback. Mm-hmm. And the pushback was largely due to the economic critique that was using Marxist analysis to try and understand what's going on, why, trying to get at the systemic level of it. And there's a big fear of Marxism in the European context where the theology was being done that primarily influenced the Roman Catholic Church. And so there was this living memory of failed Marxist states and all of this kind of tension that was going on. And so the pushback was to silence a lot of these liberation theologians, to actually censor them. There's a really good response that Gutierrez wrote a book. It's a small little book that comes out after liberation theology, and it's a response to what happens with the Roman Catholic Church in Europe. And it's called "We Drink from Our Own Wells," and it's probably the best place to go and get the information that you're looking for. And it's another accessible read. But back to the question, hopefully that helps a little bit. So why is it that all of these non-Latin Americans were sent back home?
Was he trying to maybe stop the idea of like the white savior complex, which is a pretty common thing when you talked about missionary tourism? It's generally a bunch of white people going in, taking pictures, posting to social media about how great they are, and then leaving.
Mm-hmm. And you're right, and it's deeper, a little deeper than that. He was telling them they had to go do this work in their own contexts, because the white savior idea is that we're coming in and we're bringing a solution from our culture, as if our culture is everything's okay. But our culture is part of the problem. Our economic systems are part of the problem. So calling for people to go back and to do this in their own context was calling them to actually begin to be liberation theologians and political theologians where they were, critiquing their own structures, their own systems that have become the agents of this injustice in the world. So it's a very interesting thing. You know, Moltmann, we could say Moltmann was like one of the founders of this political theology, coming out of the post World War II context. When they were having their big conference in Medellin, Moltmann went to go attend, and he was greeted by I think it was Hugo Assmann who came up to him and said, "You need to go home." And said, "We don't want you here." And yet it's his books they're reading. So it's not that it's not his influence that they're working from, but they're saying, you have nothing to offer us. You're doing the work in your context. And so he sent him off. Moltmann writes about that in one of his books, how he was, that's how he was greeted. And even though there's, you know, was it Ella Carez, who's in Ella Carez's blood, like on the floor, where Ella Carez was a liberation theologian in what country was he? In Ecuador? Anyway, he built a school, and his idea was to give education to everyone. And so that was how he was trying to enact it. And so he built a school that didn't turn people away. It made ways for people to get an education so they could begin to work on this as well. And the government didn't like that. So they came in to his the residence where he and other priests and their workers, they had people that came in and cooked for them and did some other things. They came in and gunned them all down. And he was found, and in the pool of blood is a copy of A Theology of Hope, Moltmann's book. So they were reading Moltmann. In fact, they were all European trained, most of them, because that's what Rome did. They sent them to Europe to learn, and they went back and they're applying this, but they're of these people. This is their people. So they're able to kind of get into the context and do the work because they have solidarity with these people. So when we say that liberation theology begins with context, we are saying that it begins with a moment of solidarity. Solidarity is not just saying it's not just saying I'm standing with someone. We have this conversation a lot when we talk about allyship these days, because allyship is it really only works if you're stepping into the situation and owning what people are going through. An ally has to express solidarity, so it has to have an implication on you, and so you're giving up of your privilege so others can have privilege. So you're giving your voice to people who wouldn't have voice, even though that means your voice is going to be, people are going to not want to hear your voice anymore. So you're giving up privilege for others to have privilege. So solidarity is at that level of it's an entering into the lived situation of someone else and the participating and privileging the other and their experience. And saying, you know, and working from that place rather than working from a place of your privilege. We're trying to give our privilege to them to hear their voices so that we can actually work hand in hand with people. So this is a foundational concept in liberation theology. The Peruvian Gustavo.
You said work hand in hand. On the one hand, you're saying work hand in hand, but then on the other side, you're saying those who went to other countries to help go home.
That's right. So, so the challenge for someone coming from the West to work, or coming from the I'm thinking global West. So I'm thinking someone coming from North America, for instance, to go to work in Latin America, is that they're, they've got two choices. They can actually give up their sense of who they are as a person from North America with all the privileges of that and enter into the lived context of the other. But it's not a small task. It's so this is why it's hard. And the other thing is why they were keen to send them back was because in their context, they had privilege that they could lay down in a way that could actually get at the problems that were going on in their context. So for them to come in and lay down your privilege, but you can always just hightail it out of there is kind of not exactly the point. So it is, there's a kind of a complexity to it. And having solidarity, like I every time I hear like solidarity, I think about incarnation. I think about Jesus who, doesn't consider his full stature, but enters into this vulnerable lived situation of humanity and lives as one of us in solidarity with us and experiences all of what we experience just as we would experience it. And sometimes we want to keep Jesus above all of that. But really, Jesus is powerful in his humility. Jesus is powerful in that he enters into that lived situation and even faces death for standing in that place and giving up his privilege. Blythe, did you want to add something or?
Well, I just wanted to, like you're saying, assimilate with that community in order to give up what you had in order to help them?
Yeah, so the confusion here is when I'm asking someone who's in that context. So say for instance, with Archbishop Romero, he's quite a famous case. And so he was a bishop, a Roman Catholic bishop, and he's working amongst the people that are rich within that context. And he has all kinds of privilege. But when he sees the way that people are living, it causes him to actually put things at risk, put everything at risk for the sake of the other. So he lays down his privilege to give voice to what's going on in the lives of the poor. And so he has a particular way to express solidarity that is not really accessible to someone who's not from that context. It doesn't mean that you can't have people that can step into it, but really we need people that are willing to step into the mess of their own context so that they can address the problems, the systemic problems that are there.
And live the spiritual poverty.
And live the spiritual poverty?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'd have to unpack that a little bit and think about that. But yeah, because that's that particular thinking, and I know that you've been engaging with that a little bit. So anyway, Tan.
Yes, during I study Gustavo Gutierrez, and he referred Che Guevara. I mean, in Bolivia, so it is a libertarian part of the revolutionary movement, which I'd like to know.
Yeah, see, this is why especially the Americans became so Americans. People in the United States became really up in arms about anything that speaks of revolution, which is odd because their whole culture kind of starts with revolution. But the revolution in Marxist way is a way of upending society. And so there is a revolutionary thrust in liberation theology because it's saying there has to be a change. Does it have to be this complete upending of society? Well, in some ways, yes, because the way that the structure of the society is that there are a few families that managed to get in good with the colonizers, and they live like kings while everyone else is living on garbage dumps and scraping together a living. So it's the contrast between the haves and the have-nots is so big, and the people who are in the haves, they don't want to lose what they have, so they fight against anything that's going to threaten that. And so the only option, this was a big thing. If you watch the movie Romero, I highly recommend it. It's all on YouTube, but they really get at the fact that this was the thing that the ministers were wrestling with, and one of them actually started. He picked up guns and went out to fight for the poor. And so, and he had really bought into the whole Marxist revolution, overthrowing everything. So yeah, it is all tangled up in there, Ton. But it's it's hard to imagine how else you're going to address the inequity that's there without something drastically changing. And we're not good at working towards a solution that we all can work together towards, because we, especially people who are in privilege, really want to hold on to their privilege. They don't want to give it up. It's rare for people to do that. And I know that you have lived experience of this, of standing in solidarity. So that's, you have a very valuable contribution to add to this conversation. Krista?
This is probably not going to be an unpopular statement, but I sometimes take a great offense to the word privilege. And I
Okay.
take it because I guess I do, because it is assumed in a lot of respects that what individuals have, for example, that live in Canada, got it because of privilege. And that's not always the case. I have a
No,
lot,
not always
but it's
the
not
case.
a privilege. It's not a privilege. I worked extremely hard and I had a lot of hardships to get where I was. So sometimes I take offense when people say, oh, you have privilege. Well, no, not everything was a privilege for me, because you have a job, that's a privilege. You should feel privileged because you have a job. That's not the case for me. So sometimes I think the word is thrown out a lot because we live in a country like Canada, that it's assumed that everything we have is unearned and it's a privilege. So just my little comment on that word.
No, it's a really good comment, because if normally I do an exercise on trying to uncover or excavate the privilege that we do have, because it's different for people. Like, for instance, as a white man, I have certain privileges in the culture.
Yeah.
But there's lots of things that I had to overcome. I mean, I come from a very working class family. I'm the first one to have a doctorate. So there's things that I worked hard for, but the fact that I could actually do that as easily as I did is partially because of the privilege that I have in society. It doesn't mean you don't work, but it does mean that when we start to do this work, we need to dig in to figure out, well, what privileges do we hold? What privileges and what things can we offer, in terms of how we unmask the way that those privileges function, and especially the privileges that work against us, and hearing the voice of people who have lived on the other side of that and have experienced it from the other side. Jennifer?
The way I always think about privilege is, do I have something actively working against me? So, yes, I'm a woman, so that, can go against me societally and stuff. But I was pulled over by the police officer. I was speeding, it was my fault. And my first thought was, I will not be profiled because of my race. I will go home and see my children tonight. It was not keep both hands on the wheel and, be very, very cautious of my movements. When I apply for a job, my name is Jennifer Gillis White. Nobody is going to go, oh, well, did she get this job because of an action program necessarily. If I walk into the store, I'm not having somebody follow me around. So it's not to say that when we say we have privilege, it doesn't mean we didn't work hard for something. It didn't mean we had to do as much as somebody else. It means that the system is not actively working against me and that I benefit from the system, whether I want to or not. I benefit from a system that puts other people down.
Hmm. Yeah, and this is where it's really important to hear the voices of the people that experience the other side of it. Because it's not until we hear the ways that people are fighting against the system that we can recognize, oh, yeah, that, I may have done all kinds of other things that really were hard, but that I didn't find hard. And being pulled over by the police is a really good example. As, as a white male, I don't expect to be pulled over, which is, and if I did, I would probably just
Yeah.
laugh, like in terms of like I wouldn't be assuming that I'm at risk here of losing my identification, or that I'm going to, be profiled and incarcerated. I don't have any of those concerns, but I know that lots of people do. And lots of
And I
people
don't want to
experience.
like tangent the class or anything, but I've got brown friends who live in the United States who are legal documented green card holders who don't want to leave their house, who won't go to an airport.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't have that fear. Or to the same extent kind of deal. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, no, it's good, and it's good to kind of get at the that this is about the systemic problem. It's not about the individuals. It's not about our own sense of self, like it's and our own capacity to do great things. But it's about the system that actually uh, actually actively works against some people thriving. And so how do we work in that? How do we work towards equity there? I don't know if that's helpful or not, Krista.
I still think it's just individual, and there's just a lot of assumptions made, and I don't think that that's correct either. And I actually have a friend who's Black, and um, he kind of takes offense to the fact that he gets kind of special privileges. Like he said, just because I'm Black, it doesn't mean I need to be helped with everything, that I need to be specifically singled out for a job. I want to get a job on my own merits, not because of my color. So it kind of, yeah, I just think that privilege is just a word that's thrown out there blanketly and predominantly against probably white males more than anything else, that it's not necessarily true. And the tables may be turning a little bit because they seem to be encountering more difficulty now because of the whole EDIA stuff that's up and coming, or that's out there now. I just don't like it to be used blanketly is all.
Mm-hmm. It is, though, the underlying systemic problem that's identified in liberation theology, that a lot of times this is about people with privilege and people without privilege. And I get that the solution isn't to go and try and privilege people, so that they're, because you can't just privilege people. That's not the way it works. You actually have to balance the scales. Like you have to actually hear people's experience, like your friend's experience, and say, how does that function? Because often we're doing things that don't, like, as we've already talked about, we try to make solutions and they actually make things worse. And so we need to have that deeper level of analysis. Okay, we're at 6:40 or 6:54. Why don't we take a quick break and we'll come back? and we'll start back in again. So let's come back in at 5 after. And we'll see you then.
Yes, Professor Frank. When I study Latin American countries, they are very different too. Like
Oh,
in Peru, it was
sorry,
very
Ton, can you get, I'm not hearing you very well.
like in El Salvador, it's very bad. But in Brazil, during the first presidency of Lula da Silva, it was quite, progress. From the 46 developing country, they become the 8th. So, it depends on the condition of those, the third world countries.
I'm not sure why I'm having such a hard time hearing you. Can you try your microphone? Just speak closer to your microphone. Because it was, I could hear you before. I can't hear you very well.
Professor Frank, no
Yeah.
sound. No sound of yours.
Let me check something here. Try speaking again. Hello?
It sounds like you're far away from your mic.
Yeah, I just changed mine so it should be louder too. Oh, Ton, can you try? Can you?
There it is.
What I'm telling was the Latin American countries are very different.
Mm-hmm.
In Peru, they're the Shining Path guerrillas, where Gutaros was, facing. In El Salvador was very bad, with the killing of thing. But in Brazil, during the first presidency of Lulu de Silva, there was quite improved. For 46, they came into 8. And I saw like Frei Bato and Buff was very, quite collaborate with the president, with the political, regime. So, what I found, well, that's just my thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the changes that came about were because of the people that were working with, and some of the work that was being done was actually helping to improve the situation. But eventually, people actually didn't continue to follow the liberation theology. They actually gravitated to another movement that worked amongst the poor, but had a different ideology, and that was the Pentecostals. So,
And then Bundesaro came. It's a different story. I'll tell you later.
yeah, there's,
You know what? Ups and down. Now, Lulu de Silva is back to, so it's quite, hopeful, I hope. But the environment condition is very bad in Brazil.
mhm.
The impact. You know better. That's why I did. Outside the classroom.
Okay, well, let's jump back into this so that we can make it through our lecture here, because we want to get to the book. So the Peruvian Gustavo Gutierrez spoke on the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero on the 24th of March, 1980. So here we are on the 24th of March, 2026. And of his funeral, he spoke of his funeral a week later. He said, "I was at that funeral," he said, during which the 40 other during which 40 other people were killed. Can you name any of them? And the students, of course, could not. And Gustavo Gutierrez says, those are the poor. The voices we privilege challenge our ideological blindness. The ideal zone of which we live, including our expectations, our experiences, all those things that shape how we see the world. More than just a worldview or a comprehensive way of looking at and interpreting the world, ideological blind spots are often incoherent, simply what we do not know. And the thing about things that we do not know is that we actually do not know what we do not know. In the voice of the poor, we can learn things that we simply do not know. And one of the things that we gain from exploring our own privilege is an insight into how our privilege affects the unprivileged. And in addition, it can stir up moral outrage. In fact, for me, the notion that women are not expressing themselves because it is simply too much effort to push past the male-centric aspects of community evokes moral outrage in me. Not from an abstract perspective, but because I can readily recognize this in conversations that I've had with my partner, Sharon. I've felt her pain at being overlooked for leadership roles, so it connects to my lived experience. Or how, if I share an idea that she has, and she's spoken out in a group, but when I say it, even though she was previously ignored, people acknowledge this idea. Even if I say it's her idea, it gets attributed to me. It's so bizarre. So this is called conscientization. The conscientization for me is making the connection to conversations we've had about her church, her experience of the church, hearing her story of this, and in turn recognizing times when I've actually not stood with her, but rode on my male privilege into roles that she probably was better suited to take on. So this is where Romero is really helpful, because the people who did put the movie together were very deliberate in showing the moment of conscientization for him, where he suddenly becomes aware of how his own participation in enforcing the strict have-not context that was going on. Another good example of this for me personally comes from my first ministry position. I had just turned 20, and I had only recently returned to my Christian faith. And I assumed that because my own teen years were kind of rough, not really, but comparatively, I guess, that I would have lots to offer a street church. And I came to Ottawa to work with it. It was a Pentecostal church, and we used to preach on the street corners all the time. And I remember my first day, the lead ministers taking me around to these various inner city ministries. And it slowly became apparent to me that I was completely out of my depth. It was pretty cocky. But it all culminated when I was walking down the street, and I was on Rideau Street. I can still picture it. And there's this young lady coming up, and she looks at me. And when I look her in the eyes, I had that sense of she didn't care. And I interpreted that at the time as that she knew that, the Christians didn't think much of her, and she just didn't care. And for me, I went, what could I ever offer to someone like that? And it was really, really, it really shattered all of the conceptions that I had something to offer, that I was going to come in like the white savior here. So I started hanging out at the church, and not long after, I ended up on staff as a volunteer. There was all volunteers on staff there, and a part of a lay ministry track towards ordination. And wisely, they gave me the role of spending my days in the market. And when I was in the market, I would befriend the people that lived there, especially the youth who lived on the street. So I would take my guitar down. I had an old beater guitar. I'd take it down onto the street with me, and we'd pass it around playing songs. And eventually they encouraged me to start busking. So I learned enough folk and rock songs to be able to do that. And I learned all kinds of things by listening to their stories that I would have never known. I had no access to this. I just didn't know. Like, one of the things was, they would tell me about how the evangelists come down, and even though they knew I was one of them, and would hog the best places in the market. And these are people who make their living off of being able to busk. And so they have a rule amongst themselves. If you see someone else comes up to that spot, then you finish up within a half an hour and let them have a turn. So it's created this mutuality. But the evangelicals that came down and preached on the street corners just didn't do that. And so I started to push back against that within our context. So what I didn't know at the time was that what I was doing on the streets of Ottawa was a form of incipient, or as the text uses the language, of popular theology. I was doing theology, reflecting on how I understood the gospel and God in the midst of a people who had a much more complex involvement with spirituality than I would have wanted to believe as a young Pentecostal. people had a lot more depth that I just didn't imagine because of growing up. Growing up in a fairly privileged context. The conversations I had challenged my theology. In fact, over time, I grew dissatisfied with the kind of message we were preaching. I felt it was largely irrelevant to the lived situation of these people. And I discovered as they let me into their lives that they already had complex spiritualities. And they benefited a lot more from someone coming alongside them than someone coming in trying to convert them. And so it shifted the way I began to think of things. So my theology of evangelism was shaken through that. So the Boff brothers call this theology confronted with oppression. So taking up solidarity with street people meant challenging my fellow evangelists, questioning their motivations and methods. And it meant hearing the ways in which our presence in the market provided just one more obstacle to their existence. We took their spots. In fact, we would draw, police would come around because we were around. They do nothing to us, but a lot of the young people that lived on the street, they were really wary when the police were around. We heaped judgment on the youth who had experienced nothing but judgment from their families. It was a mess. Not everyone, and there were some amazing exceptions, but those were also the people who lived or attempted to live in solidarity with the poor and the homeless. In our book, let me go to the upper left here. I'll go here. Okay. So pages 4 to 6 contain a discussion about what is important for Westerners to have. Most of us are familiar with the range of responses that can lead to issues of injustice. But beyond charity, there are reform movements such as the fair trade movement that seek to create sustainable social change. But there's limitations also in the reform movements because sometimes they work within the status quo rather than challenging the status quo. So they're trying to work within the structures that are malformed instead of challenging those structures. Solidarity or participation with the oppressed is presented as the foundational model for liberation theology. In the text, the discussion turns here again to conscientization, something that can only adequately happen in the lived context of the oppressed, by our coming alongside the oppressed and hearing their voices. So let me just bump over to here. On page 9, we read, good, you can see. So we read this. So the criticisms made of liberation theology by those who judge it on a purely conceptual level, devoid of any real commitment to the oppressed, must be seen as radically irrelevant. Liberation theology responds to such criticism with just one question. What part have you played in the effective and integral liberation of the oppressed? Making solidarity foundational asserts that without an actual participation in the liberation of the oppressed, there can be no liberation theology. Liberation theology is at its heart a method of doing theology, or of reflecting on theological questions, that always begins with the lived context of the oppressed. Theology comes afterward. Liberating practice comes first. And later in the book, beyond what you read, there's a discussion of different forms of engagement with the oppressed. It could be that our connection to the oppressed is sporadic or intermittent. It could be that our connection includes times of sustained involvement with the oppressed. Or it could be that the oppressed are people we live with, make our home among, and maybe even intimately identify with. A common element or necessary component is some form of real life connection to the oppressed. Liberation theology always begins in that lived context. And from that lived context, liberation theology has a particular method. To get at this, we'll start at the experience of the base ecclesial community, or you often see it in the literature as BEC, Beck, all capital letters. That's what it stands for, base ecclesial community. And then describe this experience using a popularized form of this methodology, see, judge, act. The basic ecclesial community or basic church community is the name given to grassroots gatherings, often without formal clergy. They met for a Bible study or a liturgy, but it's not what we usually think of in North America as a Bible study meeting. These communities are not like the typical North American communities, which often consist of people trying to find application of Scripture for their lives. Such North American communities do little or no social analysis. Rather, they are attempts to use Scripture to help individuals better themselves and find meaning in community that might affect how they live the rest of the week. In the Beck model, people gather to talk about what they are actually going through. That's where they start. These are typically communities of the poor, and when they approach Scripture, it is dialogic in approach. So they're asking the question of, what does Scripture say to us in our lived situation? But just as important as asking that question, which probably feels logical for us, is to speak back to the text. What does our lived situation have to say to the Scripture? So that changes the dynamics of the way that people are engaging with it. So now it's a way of having Scripture as a partner in dialogue, and not just a place where we're just trying to find like little insights in how to live life better. We're actually engaging in a way, in a conversation, and asking God to be a partner in that conversation. And the vehicle that we're using is to engage with the Scripture. And so typically this would be reading the lectional texts. Conservative or orthodox theologies are based on the idea that right ideas, orthodoxy, will produce right actions, or orthopraxy. But liberation theologies flip that proposal on its head. It is in doing that we discover the truth. Orthopraxy leads to orthodoxy. What we do shapes what we believe. In other words, you can't challenge your thinking until you look deeply at what you are doing and how that affects others. People often have concerns with liberation theology, where it tries to balance and even sometimes challenge the prime role of doctrine in Christian life. For liberation theology, orthopraxy is about doing truth. And a huge emphasis is placed on discovering the truth about a situation by examining the situation itself before bringing in doctrine, tradition, or even Scripture. The process of liberation theology begins with the lived experience of the person. And often the phrase see, judge, act is used to simplify the method of liberation theology. So in this model, C is social analysis, or the deep stories of our lives, paying attention to the systemic issues in which we live, how those systemic issues oppress us and oppress those we are walking in solidarity with, but also attending to how we act within those systems, including how we live out our existing beliefs, our praxis. So one of the problems with systemic poverty in Latin America is that the narratives around poverty that are told, they're narratives that tell certain people that they are worthless. And if you tell people they're worthless long enough, it gets deep down into them. Judge is when we are at that point that we understand something about the lived situation, and then we can bring in the resources of our lives, our religion, our values, all bringing those things into the conversation in order to make a judgment of the situation. And this is an evaluative moment. The problem with other theologies is that they usually start here. They start with the judgment and then move to action. Seeing is not evaluating in liberation theology. Seeing is understanding. And then when we've made that evaluation, then we act. And act is the doing, the implementation of the informed judgment. And act always leads us back to see, to more reflection, because change isn't singular and not all change is good. In my doctoral work, my biggest critique of social engagement proposals that were coming from conservative North American evangelicals is that they lacked a critical reflection on their own action. They're really great at coming up with solutions and motivating people to enact it, but not so good at making sure they have the best solution, or even making sure that their solution isn't making things worse. So we are great reformers, but horrible participants. It's a good way to put that. So I want to kind of draw some things together, and we can have a bit of a conversation and see where we go. The moment of liberation theology was singular. Everything aligned, like everything was kind of primed for this to happen in the Latin American context. The kairos is a great term here. They talk about the kairos moment. But that vision went much further than the context in which it sprung to life. Liberation became a theme that would travel the globe. And in a real way, it became the test case for political theologies beyond the European context. And certainly it has also shaped political theologies around the globe. This strength interfaces with other contexts through the formalizing work of professional liberation theologians. It is in their works that we find the technical articulations of what happened on the ground in very incipient yet profound ways. And in this way, the movement is still very much alive. In fact, there's a really good book on liberation theology called Moment or Movement. And in that book, various authors will testify that this has been an enduring heritage of liberation theology. So I wanted to ask a question to have a conversation around, if you'll humor me. Let me bring this over here and do a camera overlay. No, pure camera. There we go. So one of the great themes in scripture that gets taken up a lot in liberation theology is the Exodus story. Why do you think the Exodus story has such a profound effect on the lived context and on the liberation theology as it develops? Are people all familiar with the Exodus story?
I think liberation from slavery from the Egyptians.
Yeah, so why is that going to resonate with them?
I think that, if liberation theology is talking about God's action towards a preferential treatment for the poor, it's written right into the original story. It's like God starts with liberation. God chooses liberation from the get-go. He chooses a preference for the poor. We have it written directly into our book. Here it is. God must act with preferential treatment for the poor. It's almost like a proof text.
Yeah. And we can draw so much from it too. And the whole thing about the Exodus is that it doesn't solve the problem completely. Like they end up in this big journey. And when we talk about moving towards liberation, like we're our own worst enemies in the process of liberation. And so we need to keep like keep that in mind, that Exodus isn't just about, oh, God heard their cry, led them out of Egypt, and everything was great, because it wasn't. And
No, nobody who left Egypt got to the promised land. Like it didn't work out.
yeah, and what's interesting too is that not only did they not get to, well, they went to the promised land, but they also became the oppressors in the promised land.
Yeah.
So, there's some really uncomfortable passages in the First Testament about, Israel, like just smiting whole people groups. And you're going, why is this? You want to comment, Ian?
I don't think I have anything more to really say on that. I think it's really interesting, but I think it's like that's foundational to liberation theology in itself, because you read stories throughout the Bible, and if you're going to talk about like, I mean, how dare I bring up Trinity because I'm going to commit a heresy? But if, God in the First Testament is speaking to preferential treatment for the poor, and then Jesus in the New Testament comes and says, like, these are my consistent preferential treatments for the poor, it becomes difficult to argue with that theological outlook. Like, it feels like you have to read the Bible and say, like, well, if God in the Old Testament is doing this, Jesus in the New Testament is doing this, both of these are full divinity. Therefore, God must have a preferential opinion for the poor. Therefore, this theology is correct. And we must respond as such.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting when you use that language of this theology is correct as being persuasive. Feels very Western to me.
Dangerous. I know.
Yeah.
I know. They're just like, this is a baseline thought, and I'm trying to work through it. But
Yeah,
like,
no,
it becomes difficult to argue with that theology, because that theology, if you're going to use like the scripture as the proof text for it, then it becomes difficult to argue with. Like, how do you say Jesus did not enjoy giving to the poor? Like, you can't say that. So it's difficult to kind of work through that. And obviously to say, well, this theology is correct is opening a can of worms, but we are also in an intro class. So
yes.
you take what you get from it.
Ton, you want to add something?
Yes, I do like to ask, in the 70 Common Era, there was a Jewish revolt, against the Romans. What the role of Christianity play, and the Jewish Masada that follow, and the destruction of the temple too.
Yeah, so the destruction of the temple, it gets caught up in the Christian narrative, right? It gets caught up in the stories that we tell because we have Jesus. We put it in Jesus' mouth as well that this is going to happen, and when we think about the book of Revelation, these are all the things that are being caught up into that text because they're trying to reconcile it. Because it would be a complete loss of the primary place of worship for these early Christian communities because they were primarily Jewish. So definitely they'd be all caught up in this. In fact, Jesus had zealots amongst his disciples. So how do you, yeah. But it's a good question. That's not my area of expertise, but you're provoking some interesting thoughts for me in terms of like
Of course, we try to refer a lot to Paul with the liberation theology. That time, Paul is still alive. What is he doing in the revolt? This is my what you call, what is the role of one of the Christian leaders? Peter may be still alive too. I mean, the other Jewish leader. Is Christianity very passive? Or they play, I don't know. I just want to know because you're much more.
Yeah. So that's so I'd have to go and look at some of the historical texts, but my understanding is that the Christians were persecuted strongly in this time in a way that because Jewish people were recognized as a legitimate religious body. and they'd been established, but this Christian sect was a new thing that was emerging, and it also had a funny relationship to the empire as well. And so there were many times where Christians were actively being persecuted. And so Paul lives through some of that. But there's also a sense that Paul just goes and does his missionary journeys, and he's going around trying to establish this new thing that's the church. And there's a lot of effort in that, especially when we read in the book of Acts. There's a lot of effort in trying to establish this new thing. But it doesn't really talk about, in the book of Acts, all these other things that are going on. So it's kind of like, were they ignoring it? I don't know.
I also
Thank
just
you.
wanted to comment that it's not the poor, only the poor, like it was the poor in spirit too, right? That Jesus called the poor in spirit, not just the financially oppressed, or, it was the people that were poor in spirit too, like Matthew, who had
Yeah.
money, but he was poor in spirit.
Yeah. So so when we talk about spiritual poverty, one of the things in the liberation theology context is that often that language has been weaponized against the poor. And so it's been weaponized in a way to say, well, your rewards will be in heaven. And so it gets equated with that, and that it's not the best way of using those texts, and it's also not the best way of maybe understanding them in all the contexts, but it definitely was something that liberation theologians were critical of, is this language. So in this context, they would be like, I don't know what you mean by that. but you're getting at that there are different ways of understanding poverty, and there's a lot you could think about in terms of trying to wrestle through that. Like, what does that mean? Yeah. Now, with the reading, were there any comments on the reading from Boff and Boff? Clodivis and Leonardo? Next time I'm going to grab it. Yeah, Leonardo. I think it makes me think of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I don't know why. Ton, did you have?
I feel very sad when you see the situation of the woman with his blood. I mean, what you
Oh,
call,
yeah.
it's very touchy, and it's a true story too. I mean, because they are very well desperate in those countries.
Oh. So Sharon and I went to a play this week,
Hmm.
and it was a play that was written by an Iranian playwright, and it's called Blank. And we didn't quite know what to make of it. Like, it just was something that Sharon had heard about, and so we just decided to go because the tickets were pretty cheap. So so we showed up, and this is a play where you're kind of writing the story together. It was really kind of fascinating. But at one point, the author decides to step in, and not physically, but in the script is the author talking to us. And it's a pretty it's not awkward. Like we're telling a story, and it's kind of an interesting and good story. We've pulled someone out of the audience, and we're asking them questions, and it's kind of a little bit personal, the questions, and you're going, but it's not that uncomfortable. But when he starts sharing stories about how he did his previous play, he included his email address and asked people to write to him and tell him about the experience. And he was talking about how that was so moving to him and invited people to do it again. But then he recounts three situations of people that he met through these conversations, and they were all horrifically tragic. Like the first was a woman whose husband had continually rescued her from her own suicidal attempts and only to just take his life before she saw his work and wrote to him. And it's like, oh, why? Well, this went dark really quick in this play, but it was interesting because it changed the tone and the dynamic, because you're like, you don't know what to expect at this point, but it opened us up to thinking about things in a different way. Um, thinking about these stories that we're telling and pulling out of people. If we, depending on who sat in that chair, it could be quite a different story, and it could be very dark, or it could be very upsetting and painful. It was just it just made me think of that this was maybe in a sense doing this kind of act where you're provoking a conversation to go deeper by telling a story. And when you mentioned about the woman and the image of the pelican, because I mean the pelican is an image in Celtic lore. And so you see the pelican image, I think, on the Maltese coat of arms as well, and it's the with the blood droplets and feeding its young. That's what the image is invoking there, but that actually isn't quite true as to what happens. The pelican doesn't feed blood to its children. It's just that's how it was seen and observed, and so it became part of this kind of way of thinking about it. But then it becomes a Christ image, because it's like Christ offering of his very life for us. So it's interesting that they used that, and they actually directly reference that. I know, knowing full well that the roots of that, to talk about this woman, and that it's like the pelican. And in a sense, we're seeing that painful story, but we're also being invited to see that this is a very Christ-like action. This, and that, where's her concern? Her concern is that she doesn't have anything left to give her child. And so it's interesting that it went dark there, didn't it, Tan?
Yeah. Another thing I try to notice is that the condition in one country to another country is not the same. When
Yeah.
John Paul was he's talking about his country, Poland. And when the Ratzinger is talking, he's talking about Germany. So, I mean, the condition, like the solidarity movement in Poland is not the same in Latin America, for example. So it depends, the country to country, the depth of poverty. And some of the theologians live in Philippines, so they try to represent the Philippines, I mean, what you call third world condition. It depends. So India, China, there's a lot of acute of poverty and what you call difficulties of living in those countries. And when there is a famine, there are thousands of people die.
Mm.
In India, China. And during the Second World War, when the British Army they cannot feed they cannot look for the famine. They have to feed the army that is fighting. Like these things, it's what you call the depth of poverty and famine is quite around the world. And sometimes we cannot help to. Emotionally, we feel sorry. And I will go to what you call Reinhold Niebuhr, things you can change and things you cannot change. You have to know the difference. We cannot do everything in life.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's fine. Simplicity.
Yeah, I mean,
Humble.
Niebuhr's trying to do a political theology in
Yeah,
a North American context.
sure.
So he's drawing from this too, and yeah.
He was a liberation theologian too, because he believed, especially like the black,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the civil rights movement was about another liberation theology, Afro-American liberation theology too.
Mm-hmm. Krista?
I have kind of a question. I really enjoyed the read. I found it super easy and very understandable. But in the chapter 2, where they talk about the 3 levels of liberation theology, the professional, the pastoral, and the popular, could that not be used for all the theologies? Like, doesn't that all, like, shouldn't that form the basis for good theological reflection in all theology, that you would go to all those levels?
Yes, for sure. I think the point is to show that there's a differentiation, and this is what we're getting out of. I hope we're getting out of our main text, Stone and Duke, is that when we talk about and they use the word embedded, it's similar to what's meant by the popular theology here, and which is the incipient theology. And so it's saying that theology needs to be full orbed. It needs to be it needs to move beyond that. Like, most of us inherit theology and we don't reflect on it. And some of us have experienced how that has not helped us as much as maybe we thought it did. And so being able to come back and to reflect on it. But I like that they add these notions of professional and pastoral, because there's it's one thing to reflect on something philosophically. It's quite another thing to think about, how does this actually work out in real life? So no, they're giving us a model, and this model will be taken up. I think it's Dorothy Zolé, who also will grab some of this as well and talk about it in this kind of whole orbed way. Ton?
Yeah, Dr. Luther King's civil rights movement is before liberation theology was popular. So how will you define his movement? Because he was being also killed too. So how we'll try to define his movement in historic history, part of liberal theology or not. But it seemed like, although it was not defined at that time, because only in the 70s liberal theology become exposed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and there's people who will use the language of Black liberation theology to refer to those schools of thought. But I think what's interesting about it is that it's very particular to the North American context. So it's not the same theology that's being done in Africa, for instance. It's a theology that comes out of the experience of people, primarily of African American people, who have faced particularly systemic racism most of their lives, and are still living in situations that are really hard to imagine. Like when I watch the news these days about how it's kind of rising up again, but this is stuff that's all been under the surface. This isn't new. They're not doing anything that hasn't been there all along, but they're amplifying it in a way that allows us to see it. There are some schools of thought that say that this is a way of trying to tear everything down so that we can build it up again. But I am having a hard time with that. That neoliberalism kind of notion. It seems very destructive.
What will be the theology for Gaza, people suffering? What kind of liberal theology, if you will?
Yeah, so there are people doing theology in a Palestinian context, because there's a huge Christian population amongst the Palestinians, right? And so they're wrestling with these issues. I don't know if there's what's formalized, but yeah, for sure they're using I mean, this is something they've been doing all along, as they've continued to lose land, as they continue to face oppression in the land that was theirs. It's really a painful situation, and it's full of all kinds of minefields on, how do you deal with this in a post World War II era? So yeah, it's not pretty. But yeah, there are Palestinian writers, and I think that there are there's movements. There's a potential for new movements to rise up. I think there's a lot of people who are in the North American context that are reflecting on it, who are Palestinian Christians. We have a few in the United Church too, actually. Okay, so let's go to the last slide and introduce the question for next week. I need to go and put it upper right small there. I think you can see everything there. So the next reading, I have to scan it in. I sat down tonight and went, oh crap, I didn't scan it in yet. But anyway, and I didn't have a copy on my computer because I don't think I've used this particular article before, but this is theology being done in a Canadian context. So Intersecting Voices is it's actually Don Schweitzer and Derek Simon. So Don Schweitzer does a lot of work with United Church theology, but this is grabbing people who are speaking to things like queer theology, eco theologies. So I'm going to get you to read one of this, but this is a really good, if you want to look at what's being done in our context, this is a really good starting point. So that's the reading. Yeah. And the question that I'm going to go and put up right away is, this was the one about the Exodus narrative. And actually, I've got another question. Well, I'll leave this one. We talked about this a bit, but so maybe we can make this a little more, because we've teased it out a little bit. What about if we think about the Exodus narrative? What about us in a North American context? How can we interact with that text? So I'll shift the question a little bit for you. And I'll flesh that out when we finish up the class and put something up. Any questions?
I thought I had a really good handle on my paper until we did this liberation chapter. Now I'm going, eek. I gotta go through it again.
So hopefully people's papers are going well.
When you keep learning something new every class and you're like, well, I gotta add that now.
Gosh. Yeah.
Started in February and now I'm like, oh, I guess I'll do it again.
I just keep looking at the questions and going, please put me back in my room of 5-year-olds. Let me teach the alphabet again. I am so much more comfortable with the young kids. Then I come here and I'm like, I'm the 5-year-old. I am the 5-year-old in class now.
Oh gosh.
Does it have to be double spaced? I don't know.
Yeah, I would just, when you submit it, do double spaced. It gives you a target for how, if you do 8 pages without double spacing it, that's really 16 pages. So have mercy on me. So anyway, I'm probably going to be reading them when I'm in Nova Scotia, because I'm going to have to do the last lecture. I'll be in Truro visiting my mom. So I'm hoping I am able to get a good solid connection to do that.
Welcome back.
Yeah. Well, I'm only there for about 5 days. So, okay, well, have a great night, everyone. It's great to see everyone, and I'm going to just change this to this. And yeah, if you have questions or you want to chat about any of the stuff that we're talking about, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Thanks
Thank
so much
you.
for the readings too. It's very enlightening for me too. Thank you, and good night, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All
Blessing.
right. See you next week.